There are moments in a studio when silence becomes louder than any scream. Los Angeles, Motown Records, 1966, 7:42 a.m. I still vividly remember that morning, the instant when the sunlight hadn't quite penetrated the control room glass, yet was sufficient to make every hovering dust particle seem frozen. The air was thick, so heavy I had to take 2 deep breaths before I felt I had truly entered the room. People often think a recording studio is a place of music where everything is fluid and smooth, but to me, it was always like a hidden battlefield. And that morning, the battlefield had begun to tremble before any sound was even made. I, Hal Davis, have recorded countless artists, but that day felt different from the very first second. I had a premonition that I was standing before something about to erupt, something that all my previous experience wasn't enough to predict. No one ever told me that history could sprout from stillness, but that day, it did. Michael walked into the studio before his feet had completely crossed the threshold. An 8-year-old boy whose eyes held a light that few adults managed to retain. I had seen hundreds of singers, from green newcomers to seasoned veterans, but there was something about this kid that was distinct. Not childish innocence, nor was it necessarily hardened confidence. It was like a secret he hadn't fully grasped himself. The boy stood before the microphone, a microphone larger than his face. I flicked the red light on. The studio was submerged in a faint, cold, steel-colored glow, compelling every sound to be reserved. I watched Michael gently tighten his headphones, a small but decisive motion as if he were locking the entire outside world away from himself. My heart involuntarily beat faster, though I couldn't say why. I started the backing track. Each drum beat echoed like the footsteps of someone entering a dark tunnel. A shiver ran down my spine, the kind of feeling one usually gets in rooms where unseen eyes are watching. But here, it was only me, a few technicians, and a boy preparing to sing. There was something too quiet, too perfect, too perilous. Michael's voice soared out, clear, accurate, and possessing a depth I couldn't comprehend coming from a child not yet 10. Every vocal phrase seemed to peel the air in the room into tiny fragments. I had never seen a child sing like that. Not a hint of hesitation, not a moment of uncertainty. Only absolute focus, sharp as a newly honed blade. But that very quality made me more nervous. Perfection in the studio always makes one wary. It's too fragile. One wrong breath, and everything could shatter. Michael approached the mid-high note, the point I knew would challenge any vocalist, let alone a boy. I leaned slightly toward the control board, my palms starting to feel cold. I could hear the pulse in my own veins throbbing through the studio headphones. The music seemed to slow down, stretching like a taut wire about to snap. I whispered in my mind, "Don't rush, don't launch too quickly." But Michael couldn't hear my thoughts. He only heard the rhythm within himself. 1 note, then 2. His voice ascended effortlessly, as if it cost him no exertion. I forgot to breathe. Everyone forgot to breathe. The emotional arc was heading in the right direction, about to reach its flashpoint. And then, a stutter. Just half a second. But that half second stretched so long I thought I heard a pin drop to the floor. Michael winced very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to know he had just missed his breath at that crucial moment. Not panic, not pain. Just a sudden, unexpected choke, so small that an untrained ear wouldn't notice. But to me, it was an alarm bell ringing straight through my temple. I felt the entire studio get its air sucked out in a flash. The red light on the wall flickered once, as if equally stunned. No one moved. A technician beside me retracted his hand from the console buttons, afraid to interfere with the moment. My eyes immediately locked onto Michael, searching for signs of whether he was okay, afraid, or if he needed to stop. But it was that silence, a silence that was almost criminal, that made everything so chokingly tense. I distinctly heard my own sharp intake of breath, immediately followed by the boys, quick, urgent, but not defeated. Something in his eyes shifted as if he were wrestling an invisible opponent that only he could see. I still hadn't pressed stop. No one dared to press stop. The studio became a place where time ceased to exist. Michael attempted the next note, but his voice was no longer soaring smoothly. He was fighting, and I knew it. Not fighting the song, not fighting the pressure, but fighting his own breath. My finger hovered over the stop button, but I didn't press it. Part of me wanted to protect the boy. Another part was captivated by this moment, a moment I couldn't intervene in because he was writing his own narrative. That half second, that moment of the choke, had ripped the morning apart from its original serenity. It turned the room into a place where any small deviation was enough to change the future, and that was only the beginning. No one in the studio that day knew that just seconds after Michael's choke, the entire atmosphere would transition into another state. A state I can only describe in 3 words: unstable, chilling, and full of foreboding. I was still standing by the control board, my hand gently pressing on the wooden surface for balance. Something about that half-second Michael faltered had frozen my spine as if someone had touched me with a cold needle. I had heard countless singers crack notes, miss rhythms, run out of breath. That's perfectly normal. But the way Michael faltered, it wasn't normal. It was silent. A difficult kind of silence to describe, like standing before the door of a room locked for years, feeling something inside moving even though you hear no sound. I looked through the glass at the boy. He stood motionless, still gripping the headphones. The overhead light shone down, reflecting a sharp amber color in his eyes. The boy wasn't afraid, not panicked, not seeking help. He just stood there, breathing rapidly, trying to suppress what had just happened within his own body. A technician standing close to me whispered, "Hal, should we stop?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Something about this moment told me that stopping would be a mistake, that if I pressed the stop button, I would be interrupting a truth in the process of revealing itself, a truth that even I didn't understand yet. Michael clutched the microphone as if it were the only thing preventing him from falling into the surrounding darkness. I could clearly see the veins in his hand bulging. For an 8-year-old, sustaining a high note was already difficult. But the choke earlier, it wasn't a technical error, not an emotional slip. It was as if the boy's breath had been pulled away from his body by an invisible force. And that silence, oh, that silence, seemed to cast an extra layer of darkness over the room. I felt like someone was standing right behind me, someone unseen, watching, waiting. I turned my head. No one was there, but the feeling lingered. Through the glass, Michael took a very deep breath, as if pulling himself out of the bottom of a deep well. His small shoulders trembled subtly, so slight that only those accustomed to observing singers in the studio would notice. I stood there, almost without blinking. He opened his mouth. A light exhalation escaped, but not a normal breath. It was sharp, tight, as if the boy was stepping into a dark room without knowing what lay inside. Then, the singing resumed. No one expected it to happen so quickly. I'm certain that, in that instant, a part of each of us waited for Michael to break rhythm, back off, or signal us to stop. But he didn't. He launched forward as if trying to overcome the very choke he'd just experienced at any cost. Another technician muttered, "Is he okay, Hal?" I only raised a hand for silence. Timeline was writing itself while we stood watching, and that feeling suffocated me. Michael's voice returned with terrifying precision. No child I had ever recorded possessed that kind of breath control after missing a note. It was as if the boy had cleaved his emotions in two. One part left behind in that moment of choking, the other clutching the note like a knife blade. But precisely because of this, the atmosphere grew even more abnormal. I listened. The next note ascended, then the next. The higher it went, the stronger the chilling sensation in me became. I looked at the control board. The signal meter was fluctuating steadily, beautifully, without a single error. But my eyes kept being drawn toward the studio door. The image of the boy standing in that dim light made something deep inside me vibrate with a feeling close to a warning. Michael paused for a second, not due to choking, but as if he were listening to something we couldn't hear. His head tilted slightly, his gaze shifted to the left, not toward me, not toward the microphone, but toward a dark corner inside the room. I suddenly felt my wrist go cold. The boy slowly turned back to his position, then took another breath. Just then, a very faint sound came through the headphones, almost inaudible unless the volume was set precisely. A gasp. Not Michael's. Not anyone in the control room. A thin, cold, elongated breath mixed into the static background noise. I stood up straight. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. The two technicians shook their heads. One swallowed softly. "Only you heard it, Hal?" I looked back toward the studio. Michael stood motionless as a statue. The atmosphere shifted to a feeling I couldn't name. Not fear, not disappointment, not worry. It was like the moment before a door is opened from the other side and you have no idea who is there. And as Michael opened his mouth to attempt the mid-high note, he had just failed. I knew I was about to witness something irreversible, a moment that would change the entire recording session, and perhaps change the way I looked at an 8-year-old boy for the rest of my life. If there was ever a moment in my life when every beat of my heart was clearer than the backing track, it was when Michael was about to open his mouth to reattempt the note he had just stumbled on. That mid-high note, where the 8-year-old boy's breath had faltered as if something was constricting him from within, was hanging in the air like a challenge no one wanted to touch yet couldn't avoid. I stood still, my eyes glued to the control board, but my mind was drawn toward the studio door. Michael's small figure was cut by the overhead light into a thin, white outline, as if he didn't quite belong in this room. His eyes were fixed on the microphone, but I felt he was looking through the mic, through everything, into a darker, deeper place. I took a breath. The studio was silent. No movement, no sound. Only a heavy, swaying feeling as if someone's hand was placed on my shoulder, though I knew no one was there. Michael opened his mouth, but not to sing. Let me try again. His voice was soft but decisive, like a thin blade cutting straight through the taut screen of air around us. It took me half a second to be sure I had actually heard that sentence. An 8-year-old boy who had just choked on a note, his breath not yet stable, saying that with an almost irrational calm. The two technicians exchanged glances. One softly uttered, "Hal, he wants to do it again. Is he sure?" I didn't answer them. I looked into Michael's eyes, a look I had never seen in any adult artist. A look that didn't ask permission, didn't seek reassurance. It was like the look of someone prepared to walk into a storm whose true power only they understood. I nodded, very slightly. "All right, Michael, one more time." I pressed the rewind button. The tape spooled backward, emitting that characteristic sound, a slight hiss like the breath of an invisible force watching our every move. The backing track began, slow, deliberate, but this time, though the melody was the same, it carried a different atmosphere, an unsettling anticipation, a feeling like gradually moving down a corridor where the light retreats every time you take a step. Michael closed his eyes. A simple action, yet it made the entire studio feel stretched taut, awaiting what was about to unfold. The first phrase was sung. His voice was still clear, but there was something different, an emotion compressed like a spring pushed to its limit. I didn't know if the previous choke had triggered something within him, or if the room itself was contributing to this strange tension. Note after note was delivered by the boy as if marking a map, no hesitation, no carelessness, as if he was navigating a dark maze that only he knew the way through. As the phrase approached the fateful mid-high note, I could feel the breath of everyone in the control room suspend. No one spoke a word. No one moved. The only thing that existed was the steady drumbeat, echoing like footsteps entering the void. Michael opened his eyes. I clearly saw that gaze, as if the 8-year-old in the white shirt had vanished, revealing a different, deeper, sharper instinct. An instinct no one could explain. The boy took a breath, preparing for the note. But before he could utter the sound, something else happened. The overhead light flickered. Just once. But enough for me to feel like the entire room shifted into a different state of being. The two technicians next to me froze, looking up, then looking back at Michael, their eyes wide, as if they felt the same thing I was sensing. A cold presence gradually spreading from the dark corner of the studio. No one spoke. No one dared to break the moment. Michael didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let it derail him. He launched into the mid-high note, and this time, his voice didn't soar. It tore the entire air into two distinct halves. A compressed energy from within burst out, sharper, stronger, fiercer than anything I had ever witnessed in a child. I instinctively stepped back half a pace. The technician beside me clenched the edge of the console tightly. The studio became heavy. The air seemed to thicken, wrapping around my throat. I felt I was hearing not just Michael's voice, but also a strange reverberation from the static layer on the tape, as if the note had touched something beyond our understanding. But Michael didn't stop. He held the note, held it for a long time, held it until I thought his vocal cords couldn't possibly endure. And then, he brought the note down perfectly, smooth as a blade just gliding off a whetstone. Another silence filled the room, but not the same kind of silence as before. This time, the silence was like the aftershock of an explosion that we only heard from a distance. I couldn't utter a word. No one could utter a word. Michael just stood there, breathing heavily, but his eyes were lit with a light I could only describe with one word: triumph. But behind that triumph, there was something else. Something I couldn't yet name at the time. I only knew one thing: that moment, that second take, no longer belonged to logic. It belonged to legend. I don't know what made the studio so anomalous after the second take. I just distinctly remember that as soon as Michael brought the note down perfectly, the space around me felt constricted. The sensation lasted for a few more seconds, long enough to leave us standing motionless like unintentional witnesses dragged into a ritual no one understood. Michael breathed heavily, his small shoulders rising and falling in rhythm. His hands, which should have been shaking after such a fierce high note, remained eerily calm. The entire boy was enveloped in a thin, pale light, reflected from the overhead lamps, making him look like someone standing on the borderline of two worlds that only he could see. A technician behind me, I clearly remember his name was Raymond, softly dropped his pen onto the floor. The sound was so tiny that normally no one would notice, but in that moment, it resonated like a gunshot, making Michael slightly jerk his head. An extremely small movement, but enough for me to realize he was still haunted by the moment of the choke. I slowly reached out to the control board and pressed the stop button. The tape stopped, but somehow the echo of the second take still lingered in my head. No one in the room spoke. I couldn't tell if it was out of respect for the moment, or because no one dared to break the silence that was heavy with things we couldn't resolve. I looked at the boy. "Michael," I spoke, my voice so soft it sounded strange even to me. "Are you feeling okay?" The boy turned back. His eyes were not the eyes of the first take. No longer the eyes of an excited 8-year-old boy eager to sing, but the eyes of someone who had just overcome something no one else in the room fully grasped. He didn't speak immediately. He just blinked once, then twice, as if trying to clear something lingering in his mind. Finally, he pursed his lips and nodded slightly. "I'm fine." But I knew he wasn't entirely fine. His voice had an unmistakable tension, as if he had just stepped away from a cliff edge where one careless move would have sent him plummeting. I glanced at Raymond. He was looking at Michael with an unreadable expression, a mix of admiration, astonishment, and something like unease. I didn't blame him. I felt that unease too. A vague feeling that the mid-high note wasn't just about technique, It was a moment where the boy's breath had been pulled away by an invisible cold current. I don't believe in paranormal stories, but sometimes there are moments in a recording studio that force you to question. And Michael's second take was one of those moments. I slowly rose from the chair, walking toward the studio glass door. My hand rested on the cold surface, my gaze fixed on Michael. He was adjusting his headphones, as if preparing for the next take. I opened the studio door. The space inside was noticeably colder. A strange coldness, not the chill of the air conditioner. It was like stepping into a room where something had just happened that no one was talking about. Michael looked up as I entered. I could hear his breathing, still uneven, and inexplicably different. He seemed to be breathing too deeply for someone who had just successfully sung, as if he was still chasing something only he could see. I walked up to him, placing my hand on the boy's shoulder. His shoulder was warm, but not enough to dispel the cold in the air. "You did great," I whispered. "Very, very great." Michael didn't smile. He just looked at me for a moment, his eyes flashing with a trace of fatigue mixed with determination. He asked, "Did you hear anything?" I was startled. I knew I couldn't show confusion in front of a child, but that question, in this context, chilled me to the bone. "Why do you ask that?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Michael bowed his head. I felt like someone was singing with me. Just for a moment. A pause. I must be imagining things. I couldn't lie to the boy, not after what I had heard through the headphones, that thin, cold, unidentifiable breath. "Just imagination," I said firmly, but I wasn't sure myself. The air in the studio was so taut I could hear my own heart beating in my chest. And then, suddenly, the overhead light flickered off for a single beat, then back on. Michael flinched. I felt my feet stick to the floor for a moment. Raymond in the control room exclaimed, "Hal, what's wrong with the electrical system?" But I wasn't concerned about the electrical system anymore. Michael's eyes were fixed on me, wide, but not from fear, but from realization. A kind of realization that made my heart skip a beat. I inhaled deeply. I couldn't let the moment drift in an uncontrolled direction. "All right," I said, my voice lower than normal. "Let's listen back to the second take." And as I turned to leave, that cold sensation still clung to my back, as if someone was standing right behind my shoulder, waiting, observing, and preparing for the moment the truth would be revealed. I returned to the control chair, feeling as though my feet were wading into cold water. No one in the room dared to speak loudly. Even my footsteps on the wooden floor sounded too clear, too sharp, as if the room was holding its breath, awaiting something. Michael stood behind the glass, still holding the headphones, his head slightly tilted as if listening to sounds we couldn't reach. I placed my finger on the play button, but didn't press it immediately. My heart beat in short, frantic thumps. Raymond stood next to me, gripping a pen so tightly his knuckles were white. The other technician avoided my gaze, as if afraid that merely looking into my eyes would confirm that I was just as worried as they were. I took a very deep breath, then pressed play. The second take resonated. The first few seconds were so perfect it was choking. Not because I wasn't used to Michael's excellence, but because that sound, when played back through the monitors, carried a layer that did not belong to a normal recording session. Michael's voice was still clear, still sharp, but deep within the sound layer, beneath the thin static, there was an acoustic undertone I couldn't explain. Not someone speaking, not singing, not a machine error. It was like an after echo, a breath, very faint. As if the room still retained the trace of the moment Michael choked. I reached out and slowly turned the volume up slightly. Raymond's eyes strained toward me, wanting to stop me but not daring to speak. I kept my gaze fixed on the sound wave on the screen. When the mid-high note arrived, the atmosphere in the control room suddenly subsided. Focused, taut as a bowstring pulled to its absolute limit. Michael's voice launched. Not beautiful, but incisive. So sharp I felt the note was cutting an invisible line across the room. so sharp that both technicians simultaneously shivered, though they tried to hide it. Then the note was sustained. I heard it clearly, incredibly clearly. A small, faint reverberation mixed into the tail end of the note. Not Michael's voice, not anyone's. A gasp, soft, thin, resonating like a small ripple on still water. I jumped to my feet. Raymond grabbed my sleeve. "Hal, calm down! This is just signal interference." "No." I cut him off, my eyes still fixed on the screen. "Signal interference doesn't create that feeling." The entire room fell into silence again. We continued to listen. Michael in the studio stood motionless, but I noticed his hand was gently gripping the hem of his shirt. An involuntary gesture, but for the first time throughout the session, he showed a sign of genuine apprehension. The second take ended. No one applauded. No one cheered. Amazing. No one laughed. There was only the sound of the tape stopping, echoing like a lock clicking shut on an old door. I swiveled my chair around, looking through the glass. Michael was looking at me, not blinking, not smiling. The boy's eyes contained something very much like a question, but also like the answer he already knew. I signaled for him to take off the headphones and come out. The door opened with a dry click. The sound made Raymond jump. Michael walked into the control room, his small feet making little noise, but his presence changed the atmosphere of the entire room, as if he brought the studio's coldness with him. He sat down in the chair next to me. His feet swung slightly. He looked like a child on the outside, but his face contained something unlike any child. I asked, "Did you hear anything different?" Michael looked down at the control console for a long moment. Then he answered in a voice so quiet I had to lean in to hear, "Yes, but only a little." He paused, like someone wanted to hit the note with me. Both technicians turned to look at him. I took a slow breath. I couldn't let the boy believe that was real. I couldn't let the choke become a burden in the mind of such a talent. "It could be an echo in your head," I said, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. "When you're under pressure, sometimes the brain creates phantom sounds. That's normal." Michael nodded slightly, but I knew he didn't entirely believe it, and neither did I. No one spoke for a few minutes. The tape remained still in the machine as if it too was afraid of being played again. Finally, one technician broke the silence. "Hal, that truly is legendary." Raymond looked over at me, his gaze gradually shifting from fear to astonishment. "No one can do that," he said. "No child can do that. Hal, you know it." I knew it. I knew it too well. An 8-year-old boy not only overcame the note that had choked him, but overcame it by creating a second take that was absurdly flawless. And that moment of choking, instead of ruining the session, it became a catalyst that made his voice launch out stronger, deeper, almost reaching the boundary a child's voice shouldn't touch. I placed my hand on Michael's shoulder. "You know what?" I said, my voice dropping. "The moment you said, 'Let me try again,' that sentence alone is what made the second take a legend." Michael looked up at me. For the first time in the entire session, he smiled, but it was a tiny, thin smile, like a light that had just managed to break through. Not dazzling, not conceited, just gentle, but encompassing everything the second take had just shown us. Persistence, resilience, and an unfathomable maturity beyond the age of 8. I stood up, looking back at the studio through the glass. The overhead light finally stabilized. The dark corner of the studio was quiet, no longer feeling cold. But I clearly knew one thing. The story of that day would never fade. It left a trace in the tape, in our memories, and in the boy's own voice. The child who would go further than anyone could imagine at that time. I turned back to look at Michael one last time before turning off the console. "You just created a moment people will remember for a very long time," I said. And I don't know why, but as I finished that sentence, I felt a fleeting shiver. Not from the cold, not from fear, but because I knew that second take was not just a recording. It was a declaration, a door, a sign that the future of this boy, though we didn't fully comprehend it yet, had begun in the very moment of that choke. A moment that even today, every time I recall it, I still hear in my head the soft gasp, the tension, and the echo that never fades.